Hello everyone, welcome back. So today we're going to look at a couple of cold press 100% cotton watercolor papers that I own. Now this is not a definitive collection of 100% cotton watercolor papers that are out there. This is just 5 that I own, and I just kind of wanted to do a little bit of a comparison between them to see how they reacted differently. So we're going to take a look at the texture up close. We're also going to look at how it reacts with watercolor paints. So like granulation, lifting, layering, movement of the paint on the paper, and also how it works with other media like crayons and watercolor pencils and pens. I also just want to mention that I am more of an abstract watercolor artist, so I like runbacks, I like cauliflowering, and I like other sort of traditionally frowned upon watercolor mishaps in my work. So just take these results that I see and my impressions of it with a grain of salt. It may mean something different to you, and you may like it or not like that. So I hope this just allows you to see the paper up close and to be able to decide if it's right for your watercolor techniques. Okay, so the first paper that we have is the Paul Rubens 100% cotton. All the papers we're going to look at today are 300 GSM, 140 pounds. This Paul Rubens is labelled as cold press, but it is super fine and makes me wonder whether it's actually hot press. And some of the sellers selling this on AliExpress actually label the fine as hot press, so I'm not totally sure, but it has a really fine texture and you can see that there. So the next one is the Arteza Expert 100% cotton cold press paper. This one definitely has more texture than the Paul Rubens, but it is still quite subtle and nice. It doesn't look super machined. It's quite lovely. The next one we have here is the B paper. And this is also 100% cotton cold press, and this texture is interesting. It has kind of like a diagonal machined texture. It's super subtle, but it's definitely more obvious than the Paul Rubens or the Arteza. And this one is the Legion Stonehenge Aqua Cold Press 100% cotton, and this texture is very obvious. It's still quite nice, but it definitely looks sort of machined. Not as much as the Fabriano paper if you've ever used that, but it is definitely more obvious than the other papers we've looked at so far. And lastly, we have the Baohong Academy 100% cotton watercolor paper. This one I grabbed off AliExpress as well, and this definitely has a very machined texture on it. It is still quite lovely. It does have some organic forms to it, so it's not super obvious when you're painting over it, but it definitely has the most texture out of all of these other papers. So the first thing we're going to look at with all these papers is how the granulation looks and how the paint flows. So this is just Sodalite Genuine by Daniel Smith, which is a highly granulating color. And I'm just putting it into a wet circle here and spreading it around to see how it looks when it dries. Here's all of our samples from that first granulation test, and they're all pretty different, and that sort of comes down to granulation looks different every time you do it, obviously, and you know the amount of paint that I put on and everything. It's hard to regulate it to be exactly the same on each piece of paper, but you can see some subtle differences, like on the Baohong Academy you can really see that beautiful texture and it's kind of more uniform than some of the others. The Legion Stonehenge definitely falls into the machined pattern of the paper there. The Arteza cold press was really nice. I think I might have applied a little less paint because it looks a little sort of sparser on the page, but it has some beautiful soft texture there. And then the Paul Rubens, because the paper is so smooth, it's a very organic granulation. It doesn't fall into the texture of the paper at all, and it's kind of just this crackled look. So this next little experiment, I just wet a little swatch of paper here, and I put in quite a heavily saturated Payne's Grey by Roman Schmal. And this is a really flowy paint, so you can see it kind of crawling into that swatch there. I did speed it up a little bit, so it was a little slower. But as you can see, these all kind of had different flow rates. The Baohong Academy is super interesting. It really sucked it into the paper and spread it out very evenly across that swatch. I think it almost made it to the end of the water there. It's much more diluted throughout the whole swatch, whereas the other ones kind of kept the main saturation at the top and then pulled it slowly down into the water. It looks like the Paul Rubens and the Arteza Expert and the Stonehenge Aqua managed to get a little bit of saturation all the way down to the end, but it definitely held on to most of the paint at the top and just slowly brought it down. So this is just another test in dispersion and flow. So what I'm doing is wetting the paper and then dropping a droplet of watercolor ink into it to see how it spreads and how far it spreads within that little circle. So as you can see here, the Paul Rubens and the Stonehenge Aqua and the Baohong Academy spread pretty far and pretty fast. The Paul Rubens almost made it right to the edge of the outline of the circle. The Stonehenge Aqua was really interesting. It diluted the ink there. You can see that the color is different to the other ones. It kind of sucked in the ink and then made it less vibrant. The Arteza Expert moved pretty slowly, same as the B paper. The B paper did not disperse very much at all. So just another interesting comparison to make. If you like that kind of really fast flow action in your work, then maybe the Paul Rubens, the Stonehenge or the Baohong are better fits than the Arteza or B. Okay, so our next little test is lifting. So this one was really interesting. What I'm doing right here is just laying down a fairly heavy coat of alizarin crimson, and then I let it dry, and then I came back in and tried to lift it. So I'm wetting it and scrubbing it a little bit and picking it up with a paper towel. So I would say up until this point, our 100% cotton papers have behaved pretty similarly and well with all of these techniques. But with this lifting, they really set themselves apart here. So as you can see in the Paul Rubens and the Baohong Academy, both of these colors lifted really well. So the alizarin crimson is a heavily staining color, so you're never going to be able to lift that completely. But they did a pretty good job of lifting the paint off the surface. And then with the Naples yellow, that's a fairly easy color to lift, so they did really well in both of those. The Stonehenge Aqua did amazing with the Naples yellow, but with the alizarin crimson, it really stayed in the texture of the paper, and I could not get that pigment out. And again, it is a really heavily staining color, but it just really did not do a great job at lifting the pigment out evenly. And then the Arteza Expert and the B paper did not do that great at all. The alizarin crimson didn't lift as much as the other three. And the Naples yellow, the Arteza did a little bit better, but the B paper really sucked at this. This should be a pretty easy color to lift, and it really sunk into that cotton paper and it would not lift, it would not come out. But at the same time, I also want to reiterate that this is all subjective. So if you're looking for a paper that doesn't lift and it holds onto that color, then the B might be great for you. So just, again, take this with a grain of salt and decide which one is going to fit your needs. Alright, so on to multimedia application. So in this little test, I used a Caran d'Ache Neocolor 2, which is a water-soluble wax crayon, an Albic Dura watercolor pencil, which is also water-soluble, and I just did a dry version and then wet these down to see how much pigment was left in the paper after wetting it down. I also used a alcohol marker here just to see the feathering, a micron and a fountain pen, an extra fine fountain pen, and also an India ink marker. So I would say across the board, all of these papers behaved fairly similarly when it came to these water-soluble media. Most of the color came out with minimal scrubbing on the crayon and the watercolor pencil. I would say the main difference with these water-soluble medias is in this dry state, you can really see the texture of the paper, and it's really apparent on the Baohong Academy and the Stonehenge Aqua because those are the most textured papers. But I really love seeing that texture of the paper come through. I often use these crayons or watercolor pencils over watercolor just to bring out some interest on my work, so I kind of lean towards the more textured version for this application. As far as the alcohol markers go, they all bled a little bit, and that's to be expected in cotton paper. It's not really a great paper for alcohol markers. The micron and the fountain pen did really well, except in the Baohong Academy. That one, because of the prominent texture on it, the pen did skip a little bit on those ones, as well as the India ink marker. So if you're looking for some really smooth work with your fountain pens and fine liners, then I would probably not use the Baohong Academy. The other four were perfect, no skipping, nice and smooth. Alright, on to layering. So the idea with layering is that on a good cotton paper, you should be able to lay down a swatch of color here and then wait for it to completely dry and put another layer over the top, and it shouldn't really lift off any of the color underneath. So across the board, I think most of the papers did really well at that. There were a couple of issues, like you can see with the Arteza Expert up there, the lines are a little bit jagged, and that's kind of user error, but it is also the fact that the Arteza is a pretty thirsty paper, so I was picking up the same amount of pigment or paint for each stroke, and it really just sucked it up before I could get to the end. So I don't think it's a problem with the layering aspect. It wasn't really picking up the layers underneath it, but it just was harder to get a nice even wash because it sucked the moisture out of my brush pretty fast. You can see on the Stonehenge Aqua that blue moved a little bit with the yellow stripe, and that's a little bit of an issue. It shouldn't really be lifting once it's down on the paper, so that might be something to consider. But I think all of them did a really good job. There are cellulose papers that just can't handle lifting. It'll just sit on the surface of the paper, and when you put your next layer over, it just grabs that color and just moves it throughout. So I think all these 100% cotton papers did really well. So I think that's all the little tests that I ran on these 100% cotton watercolor papers. I hope it gave you some insight into how these papers react to different techniques. I'll also put some links in the description to some other creators' videos that go into more depth on 100% cotton paper as well as cellulose paper, so you can check those out and get a little more education on this subject too. And I'll also put the links to all the papers in the description if you're thinking of buying any of these guys. I would also love to hear from you about what paper you like the best, and whether it's a cotton paper or a cellulose paper, or if you like the look of any of these and are thinking of maybe getting them. Yeah, so comment below if you have any feedback or ideas. So thanks for watching, everyone. I appreciate your interest, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!